Harlan Greaves stepped off the battered skiff and onto the dock at Argo 7, the largest trade hub on Kepler 22c. The air here carried a faint tang of sulfur mixed with the sharp sweetness of native floral oils. Merchants bustled around him, their voices a cacophony of haggling in a dozen alien languages. Harlan straightened his coat and scanned the docks for his contact. It didn't take long to find old Thax. The alien was unmistakable, even in a crowd of traders. Thax's massive frame loomed over most beings on the docks, his bronze-hued scales catching the twin sun's light. His black eyes, wide-set and unblinking, flicked toward Harlan as he approached. "You're late," Thax said, his voice a gravelly rumble. "I expected you 2 cycles ago." "Had a run-in with customs over at Gamma Station," Harlan replied. "Their scanners picked up some residual stasis energy on my cargo. Took longer than expected to clear it." Thax huffed, a sound that might have been a laugh, though it carried little humor. Earthlings and their stasis tech, always causing trouble. Harlan shrugged, then motioned toward the warehouse. "So, what have you got for me? I hear you're moving some rare goods." For a moment, Thax was silent. His scaled brow furrowed, and his tail swished uneasily behind him. "Not here. Follow me." The alien turned and led Harlan away from the bustling docks, down a narrow alley that twisted through the market district. The noise of traders and bartering gradually faded into the background. Finally, Thax stopped at a small, weathered door and pushed it open. He ushered Harlan inside before closing it firmly behind them. The room was dimly lit, its only furnishings a worn wooden table and 2 mismatched chairs. Thax motioned for Harlan to sit. The human merchant complied, studying the alien's expression. Thax's usual air of confidence was gone, replaced by something heavier, almost desperate. "I didn't call you here just for trade," Thax began. "I need help." Harlan frowned. "Help? What kind of help?" Thax leaned forward, his massive hands gripping the edge of the table. "I owe a debt," he said bluntly. "A large one. The kind that can't be settled with goods or simple currency." "I don't run a charity, Thax," Harlan said cautiously. "What makes you think I can do anything about it?" "Because you're not from here," Thax replied, his voice dropping to a low rumble. "You have connections, routes, resources that the locals don't. My creditors have cut off all my usual channels. They're circling, and it's only a matter of time before they come for me. But you could settle it." Harlan leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "You're asking me to pay off your debt?" Thax shook his head. "Not pay. Settle. Negotiate. Arrange anything that will keep them from coming down on me. In return, I'll give you something more valuable than any cargo." Harlan raised an eyebrow. "And what might that be?" Thax hesitated, his tail flicking anxiously. "My daughter," he said finally. "Siluran." For a moment, the room was silent. Harlan stared at Thax, unsure if he'd heard correctly. "Your daughter," he repeated, his voice carefully neutral. "She's unique," Thax said. "The last of the old Thren priestess line. Bonding with her would give you rights privileges beyond anything you could imagine here. The ancient families, the temple archives, even certain trade monopolies, they'd all be open to you. With Siluran by your side, you'd have access to knowledge and influence no humans ever had." Harlan's expression hardened. "You're offering me your daughter as if she's just another commodity. That's not how we do things on Earth, Thax." Thax's eyes met Harlan's, unwavering. "You think I don't know what I'm asking?" he growled. "She's my blood, my only child. But this is the only way to keep her safe. If my creditors destroy me, they'll destroy her too. Giving her to you isn't selling her off, it's saving her life." Harlan rubbed a hand over his face, feeling the weight of the offer. He had no desire to own or control anyone, let alone an alien woman. But he couldn't ignore the opportunity. If Thax was telling the truth, this could open doors he hadn't even dreamed of. Still, The thought of binding someone's future to his without their say made his stomach turn. "I'll consider it," Harlan said at last. "But if I do this, it has to be her choice too. I won't force anyone into something they don't want." Thax nodded slowly, relief and sadness flickering across his scaled face. "She'll understand. She knows what's at stake." Harlan stood and turned toward the door. "Then bring her here tomorrow. We'll talk." As he stepped back into the sunlight of the marketplace, Harlan felt the weight of Thax's words settle heavily on his shoulders. He had come to Kepler 22c looking for profit. Instead, he had found a deal that could change not only his future, but the fate of a family and perhaps much more. Siluran knelt by the bubbling spring, her silvery robes gathered neatly around her. She dipped her hands into the cool water and began the day's ritual cleansing. The prayers came as naturally as breathing soft, melodic words that rose and fell in time with the planet's twin sun's slow ascent. It was a routine she had followed for as long as she could remember, her connection to the ancient Thren traditions as constant as the flow of the spring. But today, her meditative calm was shattered when her father's shadow fell across the rocky outcropping behind her. Siluran looked up, her pale, gold-flecked eyes meeting Thax's darker, weathered ones. She saw something there that she hadn't seen before. Worry. "You finished the prayer early," she said softly, standing and shaking the droplets from her hands. "Is something wrong?" Thax hesitated, his broad shoulders slumping as if the weight of his scales had doubled overnight. "There is something I must tell you," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Something that will change our lives." Siluran studied him, noting how his usually proud stance seemed diminished. "Tell me." He gestured toward a shaded alcove at the edge of the spring, where the gentle trickle of water created a soothing backdrop. As they sat together, Thax spoke of the debts he had accrued, the drought that had devastated their harvests, and the creditors who now sought more than mere repayment. Siluran listened in silence, her slender fingers tracing the ridges of a smooth stone in her lap. "I sought a way out," Thax said finally, "and I found it, though it is not the solution I would have chosen under any other circumstances." She frowned. "What do you mean?" "I made a deal," Thax admitted, his voice dropping to a hoarse whisper. "A human merchant has agreed to settle my debt. But in return—" He paused, struggling to find the right words. "In return, I have promised him your hand." The silence that followed was suffocating. Siluran's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she thought she hadn't heard him correctly. "You promised him what?" she asked, her voice tight. "I had no other choice," Thax said quickly. "These creditors, they would not only ruin me, they would come for you as well. They would strip away your status, your name, everything. This way you will be safe. And the human, he is not unkind. He has agreed that the choice will still be yours. He will not force anything." Siluran stood abruptly, the smooth stone falling from her lap. Her father's words tumbled through her mind, each one cutting deeper than the last. "My choice," she repeated bitterly. "You've already bartered me away, and now you speak of choice?" Thax rose, his heavy frame moving slowly as if burdened by guilt. "You know I would not ask this if there were another way," he said, his voice low. "If I had even a sliver of hope that we could pay what we owe." Her gold-flecked eyes flashed with anger. "I've served the temple faithfully, followed the rites, upheld our traditions. And now I am to be a bargaining chip for debts that are not mine." "I do this to protect you," Thax insisted. "The human does not see you as a possession. He sees the value in uniting our families. With him, you could secure a future for us both." "A future?" Siluran's voice shook. "With a stranger from the stars?" Thax placed a hand on her shoulder, his scaled palm cool against her skin. "He has agreed to meet you, to speak with you first. If you say no, we will find another way, though I do not know what that will be." Siluran turned away, staring at the sunlit horizon. She felt a deep ache in her chest, a knot of resentment, fear, and a faint, reluctant hope. She had never met a human before, not up close. They were stories to her, rumors from the trade ports. But now one would come to her as an equal, as a suitor. She closed her eyes, her shoulders trembling. "Bring him here," she said at last. "I'll speak to him, but I make no promises." Thax bowed his head, relief flickering across his face. "Thank you, daughter. That is all I ask." As he left, Siluran remained by the spring, listening to the gentle sound of water against stone. She tried to center herself, to find the calm she had always drawn from her rituals. But the words of her father lingered like a bitter taste. Her life, her future, had been turned upside down in a single moment. And now a human would come, carrying the weight of her family's survival on his shoulders. What kind of man could possibly bear that burden? The Temple of the Verdant Sky stood at the crest of a hill, its intricate arches and crystalline spires catching the pale gold light of the setting suns. The space outside the temple was filled with a hushed, waiting tension. Harlan adjusted his simple earth-made tunic, feeling distinctly out of place amidst the Thren elegance. Nearby, Siluran stood poised in flowing ceremonial robes of silver and jade, her presence as regal as the temple itself. The High Elder presided, a venerable Thren figure with scaled skin of deep green and a voice that seemed to carry the weight of centuries. He began the ceremony with a series of resonant chants in the old tongue, each phrase accompanied by the subtle ringing of crystal chimes. It was a solemn affair, not the jubilant celebration of human unions, but rather a measured ritual that seemed more like a pact between nations than the joining of two lives. Harlan had spent the hours before this moment in quiet reflection. He'd spoken briefly with Siluran in the days leading up to the ceremony. Their conversations were polite but guarded, a careful dance of words as they tried to gauge one another's true intentions. What surprised him most was Siluran's forthrightness. She'd made it clear she wasn't thrilled with the arrangement, but she wasn't broken or bitter. Instead, she spoke with a kind of fierce dignity that Harlan couldn't help but admire. She had agreed to the ceremony not out of submission, but because she understood the stakes. "This is a transaction," she had said to him the night before. "A costly one, and not one I would have chosen. But I can still decide what that cost will mean to me." Her words stayed with him now as the High Elder motioned for them to approach the altar. The stone platform was set beneath a massive crystal that refracted the fading sunlight into soft prisms. Siluran stepped forward with the grace of a born priestess. Harlan followed, his footsteps heavier, the weight of what was happening pressing down on him. The High Elder continued the ritual in the ancient Thren dialect. Harlan didn't understand the words, but he could feel their gravity. This was not just about a bond between two individuals, it was a bond that carried the weight of debts, of traditions, and of uncertain futures. At one point, the elder paused and addressed Siluran directly. She responded in the same melodic language, her voice unwavering. When the elder turned to Harlan, a quiet murmur rippled through the crowd. It was rare, if not unheard of, for a human to be spoken to in such a ceremony. Harlan cleared his throat, knowing this was the moment where his commitment would be tested. "I don't come here lightly," he said, his words careful and steady. "I know that what we're doing is unconventional, but I intend to honor it, not just because it settles a debt, but because I respect the choice Siluran has made. I won't take this for granted." The elder seemed to consider his words for a long moment before nodding and resuming the ceremony. Finally, the time came for the ceremonial bande gesture symbolic of mutual respect and shared purpose. Siluran extended her hand, her expression unreadable, but her movements deliberate. Harlan reached out and took it, his calloused human fingers brushing against her smoother, cooler skin. As their hands clasped, a faint glow emanated from the crystal overhead, casting them in a pale, ethereal light. In that instant, Harlan felt something unexpected, a warmth that wasn't physical, a sense of connection that went beyond the immediate circumstances. Siluran's gaze flicked toward him, her golden eyes briefly meeting his. He couldn't read her thoughts, but he could sense her resolve. The ceremony concluded with a final chant from the elder. The assembled Threns bowed their heads, acknowledging the union. There was no applause, no celebratory cheer. Instead, there was a quiet solemnity, as if everyone present understood the magnitude of what had just occurred. As the crowd began to disperse, Harlan turned to Silerin. "I meant what I said up there," he told her. "I'll honor this, and I'll try to make it mean something if you'll let me." Silerin studied him for a moment before nodding slightly. "We'll see," she said simply. With that, they left the temple together, two strangers bound by an agreement neither had truly chosen, walking into a future neither could fully predict. The days after the ceremony were a whirlwind. Harlan found himself not only adjusting to the odd new bond he'd entered into, but also navigating the intricate social currents of the Thren people. The temples, the markets, even the private family gatherings, everything was steeped in rituals, subtle cues, and unspoken hierarchies. More than once, he caught himself inadvertently breaking a small tradition, only to be saved by Silerin's quiet but sharp guidance. She was patient, though not indulgent. She corrected him firmly when needed, and he found himself appreciating her calm clarity. Harlan quickly learned that Silerin was more than just a priestess or a dutiful daughter. She had a sharp mind and a keen understanding of how to maneuver through the complex web of Thren customs. Together, they began tackling Thax's debts. Harlan reached out to his network of human traders and off-world contacts. With Silerin's knowledge of local commodities and sacred artifacts, they developed a trading strategy that wouldn't just erase the owed credits but would also ensure a steady flow of resources into the community. Harlan's expertise as a merchant, coupled with Silerin's insider perspective, proved to be a surprisingly effective partnership. The creditors were not easily convinced. The most powerful among them, an aging Thren named Voxen, demanded a face-to-face negotiation. When Harlan and Silerin met him in his lavish villa, Voxen made it clear he didn't think much of humans short-lived, short-sighted creatures. He muttered, but he also couldn't ignore their plan. By the end of the meeting, Voxen had grudgingly agreed to the terms. The debt would be settled, not by Silerin's servitude, but by trade agreements that would benefit both sides. Yet it wasn't only trade that kept them busy. Silerin continued her priestly duties, and Harlan often accompanied her to the temples. Though he was always careful to remain respectful, he couldn't help his curiosity. The sacred texts, the crystal carvings that seemed to hum with life, the sprawling underground archives all fascinated him. Silerin began explaining some of the more arcane rituals, occasionally even letting him participate in small ways. The Thren priests didn't know what to make of it at first, but over time, they grew accustomed to his presence. Some even began asking his opinion on matters of trade and negotiation. Harlan, in turn, found himself gradually easing into life on Kepler 22c. He missed Earth, its blue skies, its familiar smells, but he also began to appreciate the alien beauty of the Thren world. The twin suns, the crystalline valleys, the melodic hum of their chants. All of it began to feel less foreign. As for Silerin, she still kept a distance in some ways, but Harlan started to notice subtle shifts. She no longer corrected him with the sharp impatience she'd shown early on. Instead, her guidance grew thoughtful, her tone softer. They'd occasionally share a quiet laugh over a simple misunderstanding or the oddity of blending their two very different lives. Harlan began to sense that she was starting to trust him, just a little. Their partnership was not born of love, but of necessity. Yet something else was beginning to grow: mutual respect, perhaps even friendship. They had faced a difficult situation together, and in doing so, they'd built something unexpected. One evening, as they sat by the small spring near the temple, Silerin looked out at the horizon, where the twin suns were setting in a blaze of orange and green. "I never thought this would be my life," she said quietly. Harlan, sitting beside her, nodded. "Neither did I." They sat in silence for a moment longer, the sound of the flowing water filling the space between them. Then Silerin turned to him, her gold-flecked eyes calm but serious. We still have much to do, but perhaps this future is not as impossible as I once thought. Harlan met her gaze and smiled faintly. No, he agreed. Not impossible. As night fell and the stars emerged, the two of them remained by the spring, no longer strangers bound by a desperate deal, but two individuals forging something new, step by step, in the uncharted terrain of an unknown future.